Thank you very much. Just checking, I am unmuted. Also, for those of you that are watching, not listening, I do usually walk a treadmill desk all day long, so you'll see me popping up and down, but it's a good example. I encourage you to do the same. In my clinic in Detroit, literally 8 hours a day, I'm seeing patients walking a treadmill. So I hope it doesn't distract from the important topic. And I love the introductory video, not so much the comments about me, but the beautiful pictures. I saw a lovely half avocado being opened, and we'll talk about that today. And I think I saw some ginger being sliced, and we're going to talk about that in my presentation next weekend about longevity and aging science. But I'm going to share a screen, and we're going to talk about today new information. In fact, the introductory video emphasizes science is ever changing, and I certainly believe that. And we're going to go back 70 years, and we're going to go back 7 days and talk about the information over that entire span, new findings in plant nutrition, lignans, olive oil, and more. And again, you can find me in suburban Detroit and all over the country with telehealth and my lectures that I have the pleasure of giving at Wayne State University and others. So unfortunately, we're still dealing with a heart disease epidemic that outweighs all other epidemics. These are 2020 data. We're waiting for 2021 from our Centers for Disease Control, but I assume in the United States are going to be similar. And you can see in fact, in 2020, for 102 years in a row, the number one cause of death in America has been heart disease, followed closely by cancer deaths cumulatively, and then a new third place cause of death in 2020, and that was, of course, the corona SARS-CoV-2 virus. We'll see what 2021 numbers, but heart disease will again be number one. We got a lot of work to do, and genetics and lifestyle, and we're learning tremendous amounts about both. But we're going to talk about practical issues and the science behind them today. Just to remind you, we all walk around with 3 or 4 coronary arteries, heart arteries. They have names. They can be seen on CAT scans, on catheterization, on advanced imaging studies, and they have this terrible tendency to block up. Some species just won't block up, like a dog heart arteries. But we have different physiology. We're much more herbivore than carnivore, like a dog. And as you can see here, there's a blockage caused by hard calcified cholesterol and blood cells in only a small little open space. And that's what we're going to talk about. How do you interpret the science, plan your life, and use particularly food as a medicine in an ever-changing world of data? And can't possibly talk about every new piece of data, but we'll talk about enough that I think it'll leave you satisfied. So I want to go through the basic foundation of why, in my practice, I tell patients cardiovascular disease, heart disease, atherosclerosis is reversible. And of course, if you're not familiar with that book cover, that's 1990, hardcover and a soft cover. I have the paperback in my office. New York Times bestseller, Dr. Dean Ornish's program for reversing heart disease. And there have been many wonderful books by Mr. Nathan Pritikin, Dr. Caldwell Esselstyn, and others on the topic. But we have at least 32 years of material that the public could easily read on this topic. So we have reason to believe heart disease is reversible, and those are some famous coronary angiograms before and after that surround the book. And also, why no oil diets as the basis in these heart disease reversal programs? And does that mean you also should have a no oil diet, even if you're not aware that you're dealing with a heart disease reversal situation? You could assume that you're at risk for coronary heart disease because you are, and everybody is to a different degree, but all of us are to some degree. But you need to pattern your life after the historical landmarks that led us to conclude heart disease is reversible using nutrition. Familiar graph to some of you, maybe not all of you, but what sparked a number of people's scientific interest was right after World War II, data came out that countries in Europe, for example, this is Norway, that suffered through the food desert of World War II and many other atrocities, of course, actually had a rate of death in their countries, not due to war, but just due to the general causes, that dropped. And when this was studied scientifically, the fact that there was difficulty obtaining the richer foods, the meat, the fowl, the eggs, the full-fat dairy like cheeses were all much less accessible. There was a shift to growing your own food, eating in the forest and gardens, and heart disease risk and death rates actually dropped, only to rebound once the economy started to recover and normal production of food, and I say normal in quotations, traditional, started to rebound, then heart disease started to rebound. Simultaneous with this, we'll see in a few minutes, was a rise in heart attacks above the baseline in the United States after World War II. Times were good, soldiers were smoking, women were working, restaurants were expanding, processed foods in the grocery store were available, and heart attacks started to really increase. And people ask the question, why and what can we do about it? So there were some early researchers that were trying to connect if diet and health, the changing Western world diet, the negative impacts of what occurred in Norway in terms of their diet, but the positive reductions in death. In the United States, a flip-flop, the rich diet with reduced health. And I won't go into Walter Kempner. Many of you have heard of him through a series of videos on nutritionfacts.org, but a fascinating researcher. That is not Lester Morrison's picture. They can't find a good picture, but he was a professor in Los Angeles. I'll tell you about in a minute. Ansel Keys is there right above 1960. We'll talk about him and Mr. Pritikin and such. But I want to point out to you, and this raises the question, is heart disease reversible and why no oil diets have been the research diet? But a paper published in 1951, and I told you we'd take it back 70, 71 years, reduction of mortality in coronary disease by a low cholesterol, low fat diet. This was a famous Los Angeles doctor, Lester Morrison, MD. Not so famous nowadays, but he was pretty well known in Los Angeles, who had a very large practice. And in the late 40s, there was very little to offer heart patients. There was first bypass surgery was 1969. The first angioplasty was 1977. The first statins were in the late 1980s. Aspirin was recognized as an agent and not much more than that. So he took 100 patients from his clinic who had had a heart attack, an infarction, and he gave them a diet sheet. The diet sheet was a low cholesterol, low fat diet. I'll show you in a minute. Or the other group, he said, just keep on eating the way you're eating. He didn't know what would happen. After 3 years, the test group lost weight. And it's rather remarkable what the average weight of men and women in Los Angeles were at the time, because it's not the same now. It's much higher now. Cholesterol fell without prescription drugs, because there weren't any, from 312 to 220. And just to recognize that you can have an average cholesterol of 312 in 100 patients in Los Angeles who had a prior heart attack indicates to some degree how off balance the standard diet was after World War II, with drive-ins and burgers and fries and malts and milkshakes. And people that adopted that diet described feeling better, more exercise tolerance, and less cardiac symptoms like angina. A breakthrough study. It was randomized. Of course, it wasn't blinded. The 50 in one group knew what they were eating, and the 50 in the other group knew what they were eating. So this is Dr. Morrison's famous handout. And unfortunately, he's no longer alive. And we can't ask him exactly why he picked these foods. But I want you to go predominantly to the last line. He advised 50 of the 100 to avoid gravies, okay, but to avoid olives, nuts, and avocados. And if you look just above it, he also advised avoiding olive or vegetable oils. And there had been some basis, and generally he just developed a low-fat, low-cholesterol diet plan. But particularly in California, the home of avocados, in terms of the American production, it's still unclear why he picked these foods, but he did, and they became famous as potentially worth avoiding for heart disease reversal programs. If you've never seen the results of his studies published, at the end of 12 years, most dramatically, the group that was in the low-fat, low-cholesterol diet handout section, the 50 of the 100, about half of them were still alive. Heart disease is a serious disease, but half were alive. None of the control group was still alive 12 years later. Advanced heart disease in the 1950s, prior heart attack in the 1950s, had a very serious lethality. We're doing much better than that with current approaches, but it still can be a lethal disease, of course, as we saw. It's still number one overall cardiovascular disease. So Dr. Morrison did show that a low-fat, low-cholesterol diet had an impact, but we're not completely clear why he picked no olives, no avocados. These are not processed foods. Along came Nathan Pritikin, an engineer from Santa Barbara with an extremely bright mind, aerospace engineer. He learned about cholesterol as a blood test, had his cholesterol checked. It was sky high. He loved hot dogs. He loved ice cream. He was, in fact, a patient of Dr. Lester Morrison. And Dr. Morrison told him, here's a handout on what I do with my practice. And you're going to be in real trouble if you don't make some changes, young man, because Mr. Pritikin was about 40 at the time. And as anybody who's studied his biography, which is a wonderful read, or any of his books, which became multi-million bestsellers and appearances on 60 Minutes and actual scientific publications that involve thousands of patients, because he started teaching people what he learned, and he got medical doctors around him and taught them too. And they became the group that gave him medical authority to publish papers, MDs that were in his clinic. He opened a treatment clinic in Santa Barbara, moved it to Santa Monica, and it still exists all these years later in Miami at the Doral Country Club, the Pritikin Longevity Center. So he would publish papers like this. This is back 31 years ago, and it's not Dr. Neil Barnard. It's another Dr. Barnard down below as the first author. But they would take patients for 3 weeks. They would have them do exercise. Many of them could barely walk. Some of you know Michael Greger, MD, and his grandmother were part of this program. They could barely walk. They put them on a low-fat, low-cholesterol plant, almost exclusive diet. It wasn't 100% plant diet option. The number of calories from fat were quite low. They had men and women. They saw just in 3 weeks significant drops in cholesterol, LDL, triglycerides, HDL, body weight. And they did identify that people were enjoying a quality of life and objective measures of heart disease that all significantly advanced just with introducing in a 3-week inpatient program in a hotel setting in Santa Barbara and Santa Monica. Along came Dr. Ornish. Was he going to follow the same plant-based, low-fat approach of Dr. Morrison and Mr. Pritikin? And Dr. Ornish did indeed select, if you look at his dietary pyramid, that if you look at the very top of the pyramid, fats less than 10% of calories, it was, again, a low cholesterol, low fat diet, largely of vegetables, fruits, legumes, and whole grains. If you look at the lower right, this were studies starting in the late 1970s when Dr. Ornish was a very young medical student and resident. He chose to exclude all oils, meats, olives, avocados, nuts, and seeds. He has, as many of you know, made some changes to the program since, particularly in terms of nuts and seeds. It always was a lifestyle program, including exercise, stress reduction, smoking cessation, group support, yoga, meditation. But again, oils off the list, olives off the list, avocados off the list. And that was, again, research starting in the late 1970s. His first publication was 1979. And the first full article of the randomized study was 1990. And indeed, I had just started practice in 1990, and I read his original article. This is the 1998 follow-up, asking the question, can an intensive lifestyle program over 1 year and then 5 years actually reduce the amount of plaque in heart arteries of heart patients. And some of you have seen this slide, but for those of you that haven't or need to see it again, it may be the most famous plant-based reversal outcome data ever published, even though this was 1998, and we got a lot of years since. But if you look to the left baseline, there were two groups of heart patients. They had cardiac catheterization, angiography. On average, they were 41% narrowed across their 3 or 4 major heart arteries. They were either put on this intensive lifestyle program or controls in the black circles. The intensive lifestyle treatment of using whole foods, low in fat, were on the white squares. And the amount of narrowing went up, and then it really went up at 5 years because these people underwent another catheterization for research purposes twice. But you can see that the average amount of narrowing, in medical terminology, stenosis means narrowing. The average amount of narrowing actually went down at 1 year and 5 years on the whole food plant-based lifestyle program that was low in fats. And this was dramatic data that using food and lifestyle, this was before prescription drugs were widely available and common, before statins. Dr. Ornish did allow his patients to eat access to egg whites and non-fat dairy because at the time, he was concerned if these people could support their nutrition with just fruits and vegetables. It was early in the game. He also used omega-3 fatty acids from fish because one of his advisors, Dr. Alexander Leaf, had advised him that it might be challenging for these people on the plant diet to get enough omega-3. Now we depend more on chia, flax, hemp, and algal supplements if needed. But at the time, that's what he used. So was a nearly completely plant-based approach. And it took a while because that was 1998 for Dr. Ornish's 5-year follow-up. And Mr. Pritikin's data was coming out in the 1990s also. But in 2010, the government of the United States, CMS, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, approved payment for a heart patient with a recent heart attack, stroke, bypass, stent, or chronic anginal chest pain to undergo intense outpatient education and exercise modeled after either one or two of these pioneers, Dr. Ornish and Dr. Pritikin. They were very stringent before they approved it. They had denied the application many times. They wanted bigger numbers, bigger numbers, bigger numbers. And ultimately, Dr. Ornish published research involving thousands of patients, and so did Mr. Pritikin. So they did get approval. And I'm happy to say in my state of Michigan, until about 2 years ago, out of all the hospitals in the state of Michigan that offer cardiac rehabilitation, only one in Ann Arbor, Michigan, St. Joseph Mercy Hospital, offered one of these programs, the Pritikin program. Now we're up to about 4 or 5. Some of these are in small private clinics, and the pandemic certainly hurt the accessibility to cardiac rehab over the last 2 years. Most are now reopened. But a very tiny fraction of hospitals recognize that they can do so much good for established heart patients by offering what's called intensive cardiac rehab, teaching a low-fat diet. But hopefully, we'll see more and more. And ask your hospital if they can consider implementing an intensive cardiac rehab program. You can't give a talk about heart disease reversal and low-fat, low-oil diets without coming across Dr. Caldwell Esselstyn from the Cleveland Clinic. Recently had his 88th birthday. Happy birthday. A strategy to arrest and reverse coronary artery disease, a 12-year longitudinal study of a single physician's practice. That was the title of one of his numerous publications, research publications on the topic. And I wanted to emphasize, because the topic we're covering today is new science, new questions, new conversations. His diet certainly included all animal products as a recommendation and added oils. I will say it also excluded avocados, olives, and nuts as a general recommendation. Although, again, nuts like walnuts and Brazil nuts have been relaxed a little bit in some of the patients. The diet achieved a very low fat percentage. 11% of calories from fat is similar to Okinawa, Japan, which is a natural diet with great longevity. It's not a completely plant-based diet, but it is a very healthy diet based on their longevity. And you could use cholesterol-lowering medication by the time Dr. Esselstyn was involved with these patients, and certainly emphasize exercise, but not as structured as Mr. Pritikin or Dr. Ornish. But of course, famous, and all respect given here, is that Dr. Esselstyn has taught tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people that amongst their food choices, no oil. And I want to examine the science of that in 2022 this morning. And for those of you listening on a recording, whenever you do listen to it. So Dr. Esselstyn contributed hugely to our understanding of the reversal of heart disease with famous angiograms like this within a period of less than 3 years. On the left, distal LAD severely narrowed by atherosclerosis, and on the right, restored to excellent opening, or what we call patency, by food and unstructured exercise, and if necessary, use of pharmacologic agents like statins, pravastatin particularly, if needed. Where does all this come from? So I'm going to shift gears. We have to give all the accolades to those pioneers and others that I mentioned that established that heart disease is reversible. And I'll simply say in my clinic, I see the reversibility of atherosclerosis routinely, frequently, and predictably. I establish it by using ultrasound of the carotids, called a carotid intimal medial thickness exam. That way I don't have to subject people to radiation and catheterization. But it is definitely true, and a very active practice. So I get the joy of telling patients every week, look how much of your plaque has reversed. But let's go a little deeper into the diet heart conversation. And it's often called diet heart hypothesis. And it reads something like this. And this is the synthesis of 70 years of research. A diet high in saturated fat will generally raise the blood or serum cholesterol level, will lead to the risk of developing plaques, we call them atheroma or gruel-like, or hardening of the arteries. Over time, it will allow coronary arteries to become narrowed with both calcified hard and soft non-calcified plaque, and put a person at risk for a heart attack or the development of angina, chest pain. The emphasis is on saturated fat. That hasn't always been the emphasis. And I just want to point out, this is the diet heart hypothesis. This isn't the smoking heart. This isn't the sedentary lifestyle heart. This isn't the stress heart. This isn't the poor sleep apnea heart hypothesis. Food and cholesterol are one part of the equation, but they're a very important part of the equation. So we have 100 years plus of evidence. We don't talk a lot about a German pathologist, Rudolf Virchow, but in 1910, he identified you can create a model of creating plaque in the wall of an artery, in this case, rabbits, by feeding them a high-fat, high-cholesterol diet. And this was followed up by a Russian investigator, Anichkow, that showed it also. So we had models that, at least in animal subjects, that the quality of the diet could influence the development of atherosclerosis and narrowings. Now, this is a very important man. This is Dr. Ancel Keys. He held 2 PhDs, one from Cambridge and one from Scripps in San Diego. And I want you to look at the map. This is the city of Minneapolis, where he was a professor at University of Minneapolis. He had a brief stay at Harvard, but spent the rest of his career at University of Minneapolis, although he lived half the year in Italy for 40 years of his life. And you can see the top of the graph is diseases in Minneapolis, 1926 to 1956 had generally dropped, but heart disease had risen. And it was on a rapid pace of creating more and more disability and death. And he wanted to know why. He was a nutrition scientist, had done much research on fasting, had developed, you may know that, the K rations used to support soldiers in World War II. K was for his last name, Ancel Keys. about 3,000 calories you carried in your gunny pack while you were in the jungles or in the desert. So if you had to survive with just your own food, you had a very concentrated source of energy and calories. And after asking a number of questions, he developed a prospective study that launched in 1958 and was published, thousands of pages of data, in 1970, and many, many more publications that include up to this day. And he looked at very different populations in the United States, where there was a high heart attack rate, populations in Finland, where there was the highest heart attack rate, populations like Greece and Japan that had low heart attack rates, a variety of poor communities in Italy, the Netherlands, and Yugoslavia. Why these 7 countries and 16 communities? Because number one, the researchers were there that were on board and agreed to do the hard work in the pre-computer era that they did this work, 1958 through 1970. They wanted very different populations. Let's look at the diet where there's a low heart attack rate. Let's look at the diet where there's a high heart attack rate. And let's see if anything can be identified and isolated that predicts the development of heart attacks. So what was found, I want you to look at the bottom of this graph. This is the risk of, in 1948 to 1949, of developing lethal heart disease in men based on the percentage of their calories from fat. And as you can see, the higher the amount of calories from fat as a percentage of total calories, there was certainly a relationship to the higher risk of death. And United States was the highest on the map, and Japan was the lowest, with Italy also quite low, the famous Mediterranean diet we'll talk about. But I want to point out to you, this was 1948 to 1949. This was before Dr. Keyes launched the prospective study in 1958. This was a hypothesis. Maybe the rise in heart disease in Minneapolis is due to a rise in the amount of fat calories in the diet. Well, that turned out to be something they examined and altered. I'm going to show you that. So this is planning before the launch of the 1958 7-country study, a trip to Italy. Dr. Keyes is all the way to your left, holding a paper booklet, perhaps. I want to point out the gentleman with the bushy white eyebrows and mustache is Paul Dudley White Jr., the chief of cardiology at Harvard, President Eisenhower's cardiologist, author of the most famous heart disease book in his era, the 50s and the 60s. And the other gentlemen are from different parts of the world. One is from Japan and one is from Yugoslavia. These were collaborators, and you can look around and see these are small, poor villages in Italy, famous for their low heart disease rates. And one of the first observations they made before they fully published the 7-country study, that not all fats were the same risk of coronary artery disease. So I want you to look particularly, well, look at Japan. Japan is consistent with Mr. Morrison, Dr. Ornish, Mr. Pritikin, and Dr. Esselstyn. The overall percentage of calories from fat in Japan were 10%, and the risk of heart disease in men was quite low. Looks like overall low-fat diets are very heart disease preventive. But the confusing picture became Eastern Finland and Crete in the 1950s and 60s. They both consumed about 40% of their calories from fat, 40%. That's a lot. But in Crete, there were nearly no heart disease developments like heart attacks. And in Eastern Finland, there were lots of heart attacks. In fact, the number one in the Western world. You can get a little clue if you look below Eastern Finland. They were eating a diet rich in whole fat dairy, butter, sausage. It was very different in Crete. That's a bottle of olive oil. And it's lots of fresh fruits and vegetables in Crete. Very different. So if you looked at this graph, you'd say, this doesn't really fit the model that all fats are related to a high risk of heart disease. Let's be like the Cretians and do what they're doing, because they are enjoying a nearly heart attack free epidemiology. And what the 7-country study teased out was that more than any other component of diet, saturated fat in the 7-country study was the key driver of developing coronary heart disease, CHD events. And if you look at this, this is the 16 communities in the 7-country study published in 1970 by Dr. Keyes and 17 other very prominent scientists. It wasn't just him. And there were communities that had very low saturated fat intake, percentage of calories to the left, and communities with very high saturated fat. The highest was Finland, and the United States was number 2. And if you looked at the risk of coronary heart disease deaths and heart attack, there was a strong linear correlation. Correlation meaning it appeared that a high saturated fat diet was related to developing coronary heart disease, having a heart attack, or dying from it. It's another issue to say it's the cause of it, but there were so many other studies by now in animals, feeding studies, metabolic lab studies. So this changed the perspective that Dr. Keyes had in the late 1940s and early 1950s, that it was all fat percentage calories that was linked to the rise in coronary heart disease like heart attacks, to focusing like a laser beam on saturated fat. Indeed, Dr. Keyes went on to write a series of books. He wrote them with his wife, Margaret. Dr. Keyes lived to age 100.5. Margaret lived, I think, to age 96. This worked out pretty well for them. You can see the introduction was written on these books by Paul Dudley White, MD. These books were huge bestsellers in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Allowed Dr. Keyes to buy a very lovely home on the Mediterranean Ocean south of Naples in a little tiny town called Piopi. I'll show you that. And prior to these books, the Mediterranean diet in the United States was largely unknown. So he really gets credit for introducing the single most famous diet across the world, the Mediterranean healthy diet. This is a moment of memory for me, but this was a visit to Piopi, Italy, south of Naples. In Italian, it says the world capital of the Mediterranean diet, Benvenuto a Piopi. And the other picture shows that there's actually a museum where Dr. Ansel Keys had his library. I was there, I took pictures in it, and where there's a museum to the Mediterranean diet, the only one in the world I'm aware of. It was a wonderful trip. Piopi is a town of only 300. Piopi is not considered what some people call a blue zone because there just aren't enough people, but it certainly looked to be a place where there is a lot of longevity, and it's very close to other places where there's a lot of longevity, like a little town north of it called Atrial that became very famous. Just a minute, this is the museum to the Mediterranean diet. I could have picked other pictures of the Mediterranean diet food pyramid, but if you look at the very base of it, it's lots of whole fruits and vegetables, followed by grains, whole grains. I see a glass of red wine, maybe you do too. I see a pitcher of olive oil. I don't see a stick of butter, but I do see a pitcher of olive oil. Then you see fish. It is the Mediterranean diet. Then there's limited dairy, limited eggs, and limited meats above. This has never been a completely vegan diet, as described by Dr. Keyes. I have his cookbooks. They are very definitely not vegan diets, but you won't find butter. You'll find extra virgin olive oil, and you'll find lots of fruit and vegetable whole grain dishes for sure. All right, let's create a little controversy here because this is a graph. It's a little blurry, but I think you'll get it. From the American College of Cardiology recommendation in 2017 on controversies in nutrition. I point out that Andrew Freeman, MD, a cardiologist in Denver, was the lead author. The co-authors were some very famous physicians you know, Dr. Neil Barnard, Dr. Caldwell Esselstyn, Dr. Dean Ornish, and Dr. Kim Williams. And if you look over to the right, evidence of benefits recommended, extra virgin olive oil is the first on the list. Reduces some cardiovascular outcomes when consumed in moderate quantities. Well, you might say, what about Lester Morrison, MD, and Mr. Pritikin, and Dr. Ornish's studies, and Dr. Esselstyn, and others? Interesting. And then blueberries and strawberries. Let's not forget about nuts. Portion control is necessary. Green leafy vegetables and plant-based proteins are wonderful legumes. So we won't talk about the other columns, except if you do go over all the way to the left, you'll see coconut and palm oil are high in saturated fat. And even though they're plant-based, it's not recommended to put them in a healthy diet. But extra virgin olive oil got a check mark from some pretty famous individuals. This is, in fact, an advisory from the American Heart Association on the topic of dietary fats and cardiovascular disease, pointing out there are 17 million deaths a year globally due to cardiovascular disease. And based on a number of studies, particularly the Harvard School of Public Health, if you're eating a high saturated fat diet and you substitute certain food groups, now these are chemicals that are in the food, so it's not so easy, you can lower your risk of heart disease by substituting butter for monounsaturated fatty acids. That's what you're going to find in olive oil. You can lower your risk of heart disease even more if you substitute butter and lard and ghee and similar foods with polyunsaturated fatty acids. That's what you're going to find in some vegetable oils, of course. Refined carbohydrates don't buy you any grace, but complex carbohydrates like whole grains do. So these are, again, comments that might rub people the wrong way, but we're dealing with real people in my clinic. And unfortunately, not all of them, many of them, but not all of them are going to go plant-based, and not all of them are going to go no oil plant-based. And it's still important to recognize that a step towards that direction, substituting saturated fat-rich foods for either saturated fat poor foods or no saturated fat foods, are always good steps in the right direction. So this is the famous cover in 1961 of Dr. Ansel Keys being congratulated for his diet and health data, even before the 7-country study was published. Thanks, American Heart Association. Of course, saturated fat is dangerous for hearts. We've known that for 100 years. Well, that's my comment, not necessarily his. I didn't have the pleasure of meeting him. I have had the pleasure of talking to his children and his colleagues on a regular basis. But he passed away before I got on his radar screen. All right, so we have to agree in this famous article, looks a lot like Franklin Delano Roosevelt, but it's not. 2,679 physicians say Lucky's are less irritating, it's toasted. Well, we don't always get it right in medical science, and is the complete prohibition of some of the foods that Dr. Morrison, Mr. Pritikin, Dr. Ornish, Dr. Esselstyn, and others have recommended. Do they hold true in 2022? Can science ever re-examine? So we're going to look at that topic, and we're going to probably upset a few people along the way. I don't mean that, of course, as the goal, but science needs to be discussed, even in 2022, where there's been a lot of suppression of science. Does olive oil harm arteries? And I want to remind everybody, our miracle arteries, 50 to 60,000 miles of arteries, emanating from the heart to the brain, to the heart muscle itself, to all the extremities, kidneys, liver, and every organ, including sexual organs, are lined with a single layer of cells called the endothelial cells. You can see the arrow pointing, that are critical in maintaining healthy arteries to make a lot of nitric oxide and other vasodilating chemicals, to keep at low levels amount of certain chemicals that promote clotting and chemicals that promote a constriction of arteries. And we want healthy endothelium. And there has been some data to raise the question, does olive oil harm the endothelium? So let's go through that, probably in more detail than you've ever heard presented. You have to understand one concept briefly, and it's called FMD, or flow-mediated dilatation. This is largely a research study procedure, although I do offer it in my office in suburban Detroit, where there's a blood pressure cuff on the arm. There's an ultrasound of the artery at the crease of the arm called your brachial artery, and you can measure blood flow at the end of the arm. The artery to the arm is compressed by the blood pressure cuff for 5 minutes. So there's actually no blood flow to the hand for 5 minutes. People describe they get tingling, it feels cold, and sometimes it's painful. And when you let the blood pressure cuff down suddenly, there should be a rush of blood flow down the artery to the hand, and you can measure it. And you can measure the size of the brachial artery when that happens. And a healthy endothelium making lots of nitric oxide will let lots of blood flow mediated. It's a research tool to ask the question, is my endothelium healthy? Although it is a clinical tool also. And in this study in 2007, olive, soybean, and palm oil intake have similar acute detrimental effects over the endothelial function in healthy young subjects. So let's go through this. It's brief. 10 healthy young volunteers were given a potato soup with 60 cc's of one of the three vegetable oils. And to make it even more complex, they did it with either fresh vegetable oils or the leftover from fried oils. They took what would be left after you fried some potatoes and had them drink that once it cooled down to see if that was even more potentially detrimental. They would look at how the flow down the artery reacted 1 hour after drinking 2 ounces of these oils or 3 hours later. And the bottom line is all the meals, olive oil, soybean oil, and palm oil, whether it was the more natural approach or fried and cooled down, did lower flow-mediated dilatation in these healthy volunteers. They didn't have any problem with it. They were healthy young people. They didn't have heart attack, strokes. We don't know what happened to them over the next 10 or 20 or 30 years. But there are problems with this study design. There was no soup group that didn't have oil in it. And there is certainly a routine observation that when you eat, it does put a stress on our metabolism, and it could impact our arteries briefly every time we eat, particularly if it's a salty meal. So we don't know that about this soup, and we don't know what would have happened if there was a control arm that just got soup, no oil. This is important just to understand in general, but if you look at the lower left, this is a sequence of events well known called metabolic endotoxemia, most famously triggered by high-fat feeding in animals. But a high-fat meal, particularly a high-saturated fat meal, can quickly change the way our gut bacteria react, can cause permeability or leakiness between cells in our gut, our enterocytes, can allow certain toxins called LPS and endotoxins to leak from the gut into the blood, triggering inflammation, disorders, and altered flow-mediated dilatation. That can happen with many kinds of meals. So this one example of an endothelial study with potato soup, but not studying the potato soup alone, not studying the salt content alone, could be just this general reaction that occurs after meals. In an animal study that was done, I'll just show you this, although it's off track a little, the types of fats and the amount of toxins that get released through the GI tract into the blood, you can see that they tried saltwater, coconut oil, codfish, other fish, vegetable oils, and olive oil. The results with olive oil were the same as with saline. They were neutral and they were not dramatic. It was the coconut oil high in saturated fat that had the most release of endotoxins. And some of these more whole foods had less than olive oil and the saline control. It's a complex formulation, but many things can trigger toxins after a meal. In all of us, it happens. It's brief. We can manage it with particularly a high antioxidant diet full of fruits and vegetables, but it's important to examine these studies that have gotten famous. And there is a link. If you look at the very top of this diagram, LPS, lipopolysaccharide, are one of the toxins that exists in the gut and created by bacteria, and they shouldn't have easy access into the bloodstream. But with certain high saturated fat meals, and according to this study we looked at, coconut oil more than others, and other high fat meals like milkshakes and McDonald's have all been studied. The toxin lipopolysaccharide can get into the bloodstream, trigger inflammation, trigger endothelial dysfunction, and cause chronic coronary disease long term. So this is concepts you need to understand. Just to go back to the potato soup study, it isn't just high-fat meals that can impair endothelial function. And we learned in this study in 2011, the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, similar setup, healthy volunteers giving low salt and high salt meals with their flow-mediated dilatation measured 30, 60, and 120 minutes after the high salt meal. Consuming high salty foods may begin to impair the functioning of blood vessels within 30 minutes, according to new research. So it just raises the question, does that famous oil study where all the oils showed impairment in flow-mediated dilatation in healthy volunteers, how much of it was the oil and how relevant is it? Because when's the last time you drank 2 ounces of any oil in a shot glass just for the fun of it? Most of us don't eat that way. All right, let's break down a very famous study right now. You need to understand this. The famous Vogel study. And there in the chair in the white jacket is one of my mentors, Dr. Robert Vogel, MD, a man I have some of the greatest esteem for. He's still a cardiologist now in Denver. He was my mentor in University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. Then he went for a very long time to Maryland at the university. He was, for at least a year, the medical director of the Pritikin Center in Miami. And there is a book out I have in my office for patients on the Pritikin diet, authored by Dr. Robert Vogel. But he probably got more press than any other exposure from the movie The Game Changers. And some of you might recognize that. There are the 3 athletes that ate 3 different meals, high fat or lower fat meals. They had their blood drawn after. They spun their blood down to show how different their blood was after a high animal fat diet, creamy blood versus clear motor oil looking blood. And Dr. Vogel went through and explained all that. But where Dr. Vogel, in terms of our conversation today, gets most attention is this one of his many publications, but this one in the year 2000, Journal of the American College of Cardiology, the postprandial effect of components of the Mediterranean diet on endothelial function. What Dr. Vogel wanted to experiment with was the idea, what was it in the Mediterranean diet that might improve endothelial function? What was it that might harm endothelial function? Recognizing the Mediterranean diet has olive oil, pasta, fruits, vegetables, fish, and wine. Is it one or other, or is it the combination? And this study has been quoted over and over and over to indicate that no oil is the only option to pursue. So the quick read was that the olive oil component of the Mediterranean diet, when studied, reduced flow-mediated dilatation by 31%, and the remaining 4 meals did not reduce it. Most people don't know there actually were 5 meals in the famous Robert Vogel study on the Mediterranean diet, and there were, and the olive oil meal was the one in healthy volunteers that led us to conclude olive oil is unhealthy. But I want you to look at table 2. This is a little bit busy. We're going to talk about it. It says heart rate, blood pressure, and brachial artery blood flow diameter and flow-mediated vasodilatation before and after 5 high-fat meals in 10 healthy subjects. And I want you to look at the top half of the graph. We've got 1 meal given to 10 healthy volunteers, 1 day of olive oil and bread. There actually was no meal that was just olive oil. The second was canola oil and bread. The third was salmon and crackers. The fourth was olive oil bread with antioxidant vitamins. And the fifth was a real meal, olive oil, bread, salad, and vinegar. And they measured flow-mediated dilatation on 5 different days. I want you to look at the top. That's before they ate. If you look at where it says FMD percentage, 14, 13, 13, 13.3, 13.5, those are the baseline. Well, what happened after the meal? You got to go to the bottom of the graph now where it says FMD percentage right at the bottom. Olive oil and bread dropped from 14.3 to 9.9% flow-mediated dilatation. It dropped. What happened with canola oil and bread? 13.0 dropped to 11.6, but it was not statistically significant, which is how scientists examine if it's likely a real or a random finding. How about salmon and crackers? 13.1 dropped to 12.8, certainly not statistically significant. Olive oil, bread, and the antioxidant vitamins, 13.3 to 12.1, not statistically significant. And what about a real meal? Olive oil, bread, salad, and vinegar. 13.5 dropped to 12.1, not statistically significant. So indeed, in all meals, FMD measure dropped. That's again common. That could be just the response of eating. That could be the salt. But this was an interesting setup. But how many of you know that on the right, a meal of olive oil, bread, salad, and vinegar did not significantly drop flow-mediated dilatation? Because how many of us drink pure olive oil like the previous study? And I'd also suggest it's not particularly ideal to eat olive oil and bread alone. It's a lot of calories without antioxidants. And they showed in this study, if you take artificial external antioxidants, vitamin C and E, or if you get them from food, a salad with vinegar, you're not going to drop your flow-mediated dilatation significantly. If anybody's been to Italy or is a fan of Italy or the fan of the food of Italy, what's a salad called that has olive oil, bread, salad, and vinegar in it? It's called a panzanella salad. It's one of the classic delicious salads, I think originally from the flower market of Rome, if I'm right, if I remember. But the way they eat in traditional Mediterranean diets are not significantly endothelial harming. So maybe the Vogel study says, eat real food combined with real whole food plant-based components to balance metabolic endotoxemia with the natural antioxidants that seem to blunt it. But this is where a lot of the whole hullabaloo that has led to no oil came from. Maybe it should be no olive oil in bread alone. Maybe it should be always, if you're doing it, olive oil, bread, salad, and vinegar. And I just want you to look at that because this is the whole deal. This is the science. There is no other science that gets quoted over and over and attributed to Dr. Vogel. Now, I'm not a fan of canola oil, but there are research studies that suggest canola oil has cardiac benefits, certainly in place of butter. I won't go into the Leon Heart trial where they did that in the 1990s, took away butter and put in a canola oil margarine spread and showed a absolutely remarkable reduction in heart events in people with heart disease. But canola oil is a polyunsaturated fat-rich substitute for butter and lard that shouldn't necessarily always be off the menu if it keeps people focused on their diet. And it doesn't seem to be statistically creating endothelial dysfunction. It would have been nice if they had measured canola oil, bread, salad, and vinegar, but we don't have that arm. So maybe it's okay to eat a panzanella salad with the abbreviation EVO, and you might know that's extra virgin olive oil. What a beautiful salad here, but are we harming it if we put extra virgin olive oil in addition to the vinegar? According to Dr. Vogel's randomized prospective study in healthy volunteers, we're actually not. But these are short-term endothelial studies, and we've got real patients living real lives. So what's the limitation of the Vogel study? Small, brief, 3 hours. Normal volunteers, not heart patients. There really wasn't an olive oil only group. They did use extra virgin olive oil, but the brand and the purity was not reported. And finally, there is something called high polyphenol extra virgin olive oil, and it was apparently not studied. And to point out my own knowledge of the area, you can purchase high polyphenol olive oil. You can purchase a brand from Greek. I'll try and say it, Leocarius, and it's available on one of those big online merchants. You know what I'm talking about. You can buy super concentrated polyphenol olive oil from Morocco called Alive. I don't have any interest in the company. And there actually are even capsules of concentrated dried powders coming from all parts of organic olive oil trees and all the components. They're going to be lower for sure in fat content than the olive oil itself, but they provide the high polyphenol option that olives, olive trees, olive leaves all may sustain. These were not studied in the famous Vogel research study. In fact, the product in the red bottle has been studied in people with prediabetes, diabetes, and other metabolic conditions, and acts almost like a medication. Although, again, I have no financial interest in that company. I'm just aware of them. All right, how about a couple other question marks? How about the effect of extra virgin olive oil and butter on endothelial function in type 1 diabetics, just published last year? 10 type 1 diabetics, 6 healthy controls, a test meal with extra virgin olive oil, a separate test meal with butter. Flow-mediated dilatation was measured. Flow-mediated dilatation increased after the extra virgin olive oil meal compared with butter. Raises questions. How about a systemic review and meta-analysis published in 2015? All the studies combined and met the criteria: effect of extra virgin olive oil on markers of inflammation and endothelial function. 30 studies, 3,106 participants. Extra virgin olive oil resulted in lower inflammation compared to controls as measured by high sensitivity C-reactive protein. Flow-mediated dilatation rose overall in olive oil interventions. There were 8 trials. Evidence that olive oil might exert beneficial effects on endothelial function was the conclusion. Not exactly what we sometimes hear from the community of scientists that we know. And then I've got to spend a few more minutes on this major scientific project that I suspect you are not familiar with, but you will be now. We're looking at a 2020 publication, one of many, in a respected journal, PLOS Medicine. Let me read the title: Mediterranean Diet and Endothelial Function in Patients with Coronary Heart Disease, an analysis of the CardioPrev randomized clinical trial. CardioPrev, I want you to learn that word. CardioPrev study. Coronary diet intervention with olive oil and cardiovascular prevention is what that abbreviation stands for. And I want to point out a few things. This is recent research, and there's a number of papers. It's a randomized controlled trial. It's not just an observation. It's measuring endothelial function in patients with heart disease, not in healthy 20-year-old control volunteers. And it's combining the Mediterranean diet and extra virgin olive oil the way people really eat, like a panzanella salad, not necessarily a beaker full of oil alone. And this is a big study. It's ongoing. It's in Spain. It's a randomized clinical trial involving 1,002 patients with coronary artery disease, not healthy volunteers, that are undergoing one of 2 diets in a randomized design. The 2 groups, one is a Mediterranean diet with 502 patients. One is a low-fat version, and they're following these people for 7 years, not for 3 hours. The 2 diets are less than 30% calories from fat with a reduced intake of extra virgin olive oil, and overall less than 10% of calories from saturated fat, which I'm all for that. And it's being compared to a Mediterranean diet with over 35% of calories from fat, but keeping the saturated fat content also low. Everybody recognizes it's not a good idea to raise saturated fat in the diet. And you can create a Mediterranean diet that's higher in total fat. That would be the diet of Crete, and still low in saturated fat, following most guidelines like the American Heart Association, World Health Organization, and others. Some of you might say right away, less than 30% calories from fat is not 10% or 11%, like Dr. Ornish, Mr. Pritikin, Dr. Esselstyn, Dr. Morrison. And that's true. There is not an ultra low fat diet in this research group, because that represents what people in Spain following the Mediterranean diet are willing to accept, do. And remember, you got to keep them in the trial for 7 years here. All right, let's proceed to the next slide. The participants assigned to the Mediterranean higher fat diet were given free extra virgin olive oil, 1 liter a week. The amount was not intended to be for the exclusive use of the participant, for the whole family to use at home if needed. The participants were not told to use all of the oil, but just as much as they needed in the regular diet. The participants randomized to the lower fat diet received recommendations focused on limiting all types of fat, from both animal and vegetable sources and on increasing the intake of complex carbohydrates. Sound a lot like the diet that is taught and should be taught to heart patients. But is it possible that this higher fat Mediterranean enhanced extra virgin olive oil diet has any credibility, given that we've heard about the Vogel study over and over? And I don't want to go too deep into it, but I do want to read this. Patients who followed the Mediterranean diet had higher flow-mediated dilatation at 1 year compared with those in the low-fat diet, with a difference between diets of 2.6%, even in those patients with severe endothelial dysfunction. We observed higher endothelial progenitor cells, a marker of healthy endothelium. We observed higher endothelial progenitor cell levels and lower endothelial debris after the Mediterranean diet compared with the low-fat diet in all patients. Those are good things in the high-fat diet. We also observed lower intracellular reactive oxygen species, ROS, production. We saw lower cellular apoptosis and higher cellular proliferation and angiogenesis after the Mediterranean diet than the low-fat diet. Each dietary intervention was associated with distinct changes in epigenetic and proteomic factors that modulate biologic processes associated with endothelial function. Let me read the conclusions. Our results suggest that the Mediterranean diet better modulates endothelial function compared with a low-fat diet, as associated with a better balance of vascular homeostasis, in coronary heart disease patients, even in those with severe endothelial function. So we have to point out why this is such a landmark study. 1, it is randomized. 2, it's large. 3, it's long-term, although this was 1-year data. I'll show you in a minute 5-year data, and the study's ongoing. Number 4, very, very sophisticated measures of artery function were used. Not just flow-mediated dilatation for 3 hours, but some of the most advanced measures that are not necessarily clinically available, like endothelial progenitor cell production, which I've heard the amazing Dr. Esselstyn talk about in his lectures, but here they were measured, and they were better, higher, and more robust in the Mediterranean diet with the higher total fat calories, although still low in saturated fat, than in the other diet group. Of course, they did have dietary questionnaire data to show that there was a significant difference in the actual diet eaten by these two groups of patients. The randomization did work. Very provocative data, I think you'd agree. This is from their study, changes pre and post. And if you look at the top, we'll just look at that. Flow-mediated dilatation, changes post and pre. In the group that was on the Mediterranean diet with the enhanced extra virgin olive oil, there was an increase in flow-mediated dilatation with the high extra virgin olive oil diet. There was an increase in the percentage of EPCs, endothelial progenitor cells, and there was less apoptotic cells. That's another good thing found in the arm that was randomized to the high extra virgin olive oil Mediterranean diet version. Now, that's not the only study that they did. They did a study on kidney function. Long-term consumption of the Mediterranean diet or a low-fat diet on kidney function in coronary heart disease patients. Separate publication, the CardioPrev randomized clinical trial. The long-term consumption of a Mediterranean diet rich in extra virgin olive oil, when compared to a low-fat diet, may preserve kidney function, as shown by a reduced decline in glomerular filtration rate, kidney function, in coronary heart disease patients with type 2 diabetes. Patients with mildly impaired glomerular filtration rate may benefit more from the beneficial effect of the consumption of the Mediterranean diet in preserving kidney function. These findings reinforce the clinical benefits of the Mediterranean diet in the context of the secondary cardiovascular disease prevention. Just like that 2017 article by the American College of Cardiology, Controversies in Nutrition, lead author Andrew Freeman and our friends Dr. Bernard, Dr. Williams, Dr. Ornish, and Dr. Esselstyn, very consistent. And this is perhaps the most provocative of the CardioPrev publications, published November 2021 in a journal called Stroke. Mediterranean diet and atherosclerosis progression in coronary heart disease. an analysis of the CardioPrev randomized clinical trial. So let's go through this. They used a measure I use in my clinic in Detroit called carotid IMT, intimal medial thickness ultrasound. And they did it at baseline, and they did it at 5 years to look at the amount of plaque in the carotid artery in these two groups in the CardioPrev trial. Now let's read the data. The Mediterranean diet decreased IMT, intimal medial thickness. To decrease it is a benefit. The Mediterranean diet decreased thickness at 5 years, maintained at 7 years compared to baseline. The low-fat diet did not modify the intimal medial thickness in the carotid arteries. The intimal medial thickness and the carotid maximal plaque height were more decreased after the Mediterranean diet compared to the low-fat diet throughout the follow-up. That's a good thing to have your plaque reduced. It's a good thing to have your thickness reduced. There were benefits by imaging the carotid arteries substantiated in the higher olive oil group. Whoa, this is 1,002 patients with heart disease followed up for up to 7 years. We've never seen data like this before. Blows everything out of the water. What's the next bullet point? Long-term consumption of a Mediterranean diet rich in extra virgin olive oil, if compared to a low-fat diet, was associated with decreased atherosclerosis progression, as shown by reduced intimal medial thickness carotid findings and carotid plaque height. These findings reinforce the clinical benefits of the Mediterranean diet in the context of secondary cardiovascular prevention. Let that sink in for a minute, because this is a quality study. If any arguments can be made, the extra virgin olive oil was donated by the olive oil industry, and one always has to question funding influence. However, the scientists in the study are eminent. The journals that the results are published in and peer-reviewed are eminent. And it's very consistent with lots of other data. So this is a graph, a picture from their study. You can see a Mediterranean diet with extra virgin olive oil in the middle, a lower fat version with lots of the foods we love and we should certainly eat, whole grains and legumes and beans and peas. But you can see that only one of them resulted in a lessening of the intimal medial thickness of the carotid arteries. That was the Mediterranean diet. Only one resulted in decreased plaque height on the carotid ultrasound, the Mediterranean diet. Neither of them were associated with the number of plaques, but I'd be very happy if my patients had a reduction. In fact, that's what I see in my patients, a reduction in intimal medial thickness and carotid plaque height by any measure. And the higher oil content Mediterranean version was the winner in this randomized long-term study. All right, that's got to cause you to shake your head a little bit, but we're not done. Just recently, the Harvard School of Public Health in 2021 looked at olive oil consumption and the risk of cardiovascular disease. 63,867 healthy women at the onset of the study, 35,312 healthy men, 1990 to 2014. They provided dietary information every 4 years. They were all healthy at the beginning, but over 10,000 of them developed cardiovascular disease with an average follow-up of close to 24 years. Those that had a half a tablespoon or more of extra virgin olive oil daily had lowered risk of cardiovascular disease development by 15% overall, and for coronary heart disease like heart attacks, 21%. They also have the ability to model what happens if you're eating butter, mayonnaise, full-fat dairy, or margarine. And if you replace it with extra virgin olive oil and you lower your risk of cardiovascular disease by that substitute, which is why, again, the American College of Cardiology Controversies in Nutrition emphasized that it's a much better choice to choose olive oil versus butter, mayo, dairy, and margarine. But the CardioPrev study raises other questions about whether it's indeed not ideal to consider it being a component of a healthy, balanced, whole food, plant-based, colorful Mediterranean pyramid vegan version diet. This is a graph from that same publication from the Harvard School of Public Health. If you look at total mortality on the left, and you certainly don't want to raise your mortality, you're going to avoid trans fats, you're going to avoid saturated fats. But if you want to lower your mortality, you're going to want to substitute Monounsaturated fats we see in avocado, almonds, pumpkin seeds, and extra virgin olive oil. And consider polyunsaturated fats. I see a piece of salmon. I'm not going there. I again see, I think that's now sunflower oil and also more nuts. All right, conclusions about extra virgin olive oil and whole food plant-based diets. There are no trials. There are no trials of a plant-perfect, no salt, oil, sugar diet versus a similar diet with added extra virgin olive oil. That's what everybody would be curious about. Do a no SOS diet versus perhaps a no SS diet, but add high quality polyphenol rich extra virgin olive oil and measure endothelial function short term, always inadequate, but it's easier to do. Long term, much harder to do. Extra virgin olive oil is without doubt a healthy dietary fat, much healthier than butter, lard, ghee, and various margarines. And high polyphenol extra virgin olive oil may be of even more benefit and is available. A diet high in extra virgin olive oil is compatible with healthy arteries and disease reversal in coronary artery disease patients. That is the CardioPrev trial of Spain. And it remains unknown if extra virgin olive oil diminishes or enhances the health benefits of the perfect whole food plant-based diet, but it is not simply categorically adequate to look at the Vogel study alone, because the Vogel study had 4 of the 5 arms that we don't focus on very much. My overall vote with my patients is, unless they're the most critical of critical patients, extra virgin olive oil is healthy. And I'm sorry if I've upset any long-held beliefs, but science is new and ever-changing. All right, we're going to change topics and move quick now. These are not as long. Lignans. We've heard so much about lectins, killer lectins, and we hear about various other nutrition topics. Lignans are not mentioned much, but lignans are polyphenols. We've been talking about them, found in plants. God bless plants. They're precursors found in a wide variety of plant-based foods like seeds, whole grains, legumes, fruits, and vegetables. This is important. Flax seeds are the richest dietary source of lignans. Lignin-rich foods are part of a healthy diet, but the roles of lignans in the prevention of hormone-associated cancers, osteoporosis, and cardiovascular disease have not been clear. Flax is the richest source of lignans, having approximately 800 times more than any other plant source. Estrogen-like actions, a bit like soy, but beneficial, rich in a variety of chemicals. I won't go through them all. Converted by bacteria to mammalian lignans that are known as enterodiol and enterolactone. And just to give you an example, flaxseed, 292 milligrams per 100 gram of flaxseed, compared to sesame seeds, which are number 2 on the list, 103 milligrams per 100 grams, and cashew nuts, 56. So these are all good sources, but it's another reminder, and I literally carry ground flaxseed organic in my office for my patients because of all the benefits, from blood pressure to total cholesterol to heart health, breast health. But this lignin addition is one of the major reasons you want ground flaxseed in your diet. So just published a few months ago is this groundbreaking study, Lignin Intake and the Risk of Coronary Heart Disease. We prospectively studied over 200,000 men and women in 3 cohorts who did not have cardiovascular disease or cancer at baseline. Diet was repeatedly assessed using a validated food frequency questionnaire every 2 to 4 years since baseline. Increased long-term intake of lignans was associated with a significantly lower risk of total coronary heart disease in both men and women. Possibly synergistic effects may exist between lignin and the fiber intake you get out of lignans like ground flaxseed in relationship to coronary heart disease risk, possibly through enhancing the production of enterolignans, or those that are active in the body. So this has really, to me, caused us to raise a food group, a food chemical group, lignans, and the foods we get them from, predominantly ground flax seeds and sesame seeds, to put them on a pedestal up there with broccoli sprouts and turmeric and perhaps walnuts as some of the healthiest foods on the planet. Do not miss out. Health benefits of flax seeds. We just mentioned lignans, but some data suggests help prevent breast, prostate, and colon cancer, lower cholesterol, fight diabetes, anti-inflammatory. Humans don't make omega-3 essential fatty acids, but ground flax seeds can be converted into the final products, EPA, DPA, and DHA. The good fats have been shown to have heart healthy benefits. Each tablespoon of ground flaxseed contains about 1.8 grams of plant-based omega-3. Flaxseed has soluble and insoluble fiber, more beneficial when coarsely ground. I actually use milled flaxseed versus finely ground flaxseed. It's rougher. May have some helpful benefits on the immune system and the GI tract, lowers blood pressure. That's been studied. And lignans have plant estrogens and antioxidant qualities similar to soy, for example. But flaxseed, again, has 800 times more lignans than other plant foods. Put them on the list if you can. All right. We're moving now to a next topic, avocados. Yes or no? And I remind you, you know now from the beginning, this is the food chart recommended by Dr. Lester Morrison, beginning about 1948 to his patients in Los Angeles. And avocados, despite living in California, what a sacrifice for these people, were recommended to be off the menu. Dr. Ornish on his website says, and I quote, "Our research validates that a diet with 10% or fewer calories and fat is ideal. A cup of avocado has 21 grams of fat. More recently, the guidelines around nuts and seeds have changed in Ornish lifestyle medicine. New research is showing a relationship between the consumption of limited nuts and seeds and cardiovascular health. Nuts and seeds are rich in plant protein, 10 to 25%, and fiber, as well as minerals like calcium, magnesium, and potassium, plus many other vitamins and bioactive compounds." And again, we certainly stress ground flaxseed for the lignans that we just talked about. So science does change, and important new data comes along that causes us to reevaluate, but avocados were still listed as off the diet. Are there any new data that take us from the no avocado to the maybe avocado? And again, just published was the first large study of avocado consumption, the risk of cardiovascular disease in US adults. This again is from the famous Harvard School of Public Health research database. 68,000 plus women from the Nurses Health Study, 41,000 plus men from the Harvard Professional Follow-Up Study, more than 30 years, free at baseline to the questions, do you have cancer, heart disease, or stroke? They had data on who ate what, and every 4 years they reassessed the data. Some people ate more than 2 servings of avocados a week. What did they find over the long-term follow-up? A 16% lower risk of cardiovascular disease, a 21% lower risk of coronary heart disease. And it's important to point out, these studies adjust for multiple variables. They adjust for smoking, they adjust for diabetes, high blood pressure, body weight, cholesterol levels, and other habits. So they can isolate as well as any epidemiologic studies from a database can. The impact of just one measurement, in this case, avocado intake more than 2 servings a week versus those that had less on outcome such as coronary heart disease. Again, what the Harvard School of Public Health does so well, replacing half a serving a day of margarine, butter, egg, yogurt, cheese, or processed meats with the equivalent amount of avocado was associated with a 16 to 22% lower risk of cardiovascular disease. Higher avocado intake was associated with a lower risk of cardiovascular disease and coronary heart disease in 2 large prospective cohorts of US men and women. Profoundly important data that made headlines everywhere in the last few weeks. It isn't the only data out there. For example, if you look at this study in 2018, avocado consumption and risk factors for heart disease, a systematic review and meta-analysis, look what happens to triglycerides in those that eat avocados. It drops. What happens to HDL? It raises. What happens to total and LDL cholesterol? They drop with avocados. Despite perhaps 15% of the calories coming from plant-based saturated fat and the rest coming from largely monounsaturated fat, people don't appreciate how rich avocados are in plant sterols, which help lower cholesterol, natural plant sterols, as well, like cytosterol, as well as the amount of fiber that's present in avocados. So it's up to you to consider and talk to your doctors and your health team whether the new Harvard School Public Health data in the last few weeks impacts avocados, yes or no. All right, shifting again, we're bringing you data that's the most up-to-date you're going to find. GBD, what's GBD? The Global Burden of Disease Study, a study funded by the Gates Foundation beginning 20 years ago, looking at tens of millions of people in 190 countries, 3,000 plus researchers, looking at all kinds of associations between diet and environment and various diseases. In fact, we can say for certain that cardiovascular disease is the number one cause of death worldwide because the Global Burden of Disease Study has studied that worldwide. We can also know for certain that hypertension is actually the single number one biggest cause of death in the world because the Global Burden of Disease Study looked at that. But they recently published in the last 6 to 8 weeks an analysis of foods for longevity based on a meta-analysis and data from the Global Burden of Disease Study. Although just published, they used 2019 data. We use life table methodology to estimate how changes were sustained in the intake of fruits, vegetables, whole grains, refined grains, nuts, legumes, fish, eggs, milk, dairy, red meat, processed meat, and sugar-sweetened beverages had on life expectancy, LE, life expectancy, a nutrient by nutrient by nutrient. A sustained dietary change may give substantial health gains for people of all ages, both for optimized and feasible changes. Gains are predicted to be larger in the earlier the dietary changes are initiative. I want to read that last sentence. What if you learn from this study that nuts are healthy? Gains are predicted to be larger the earlier the dietary changes are initiated in life. So if you're 86 years old and watching this, God bless you. You can make changes right now. If you're 16 and watching this, you're lucky because you're learning a lot of stuff that can help you make changes, and it's going to be even more impactful. But never give up. Age is not a reason not to try and not to benefit. So what did they learn in the Global Burden of Disease Study? The largest life expectancy gains would be by eating more legumes, beans, peas, lentils, legumes. How many times? The blue zones, legumes, the Mediterranean diet, legumes. Both arms of the CardioPrev study, legumes. Other data looking at the food groups most associated with longevity in the elderly, legumes. But here we see it again, Global Burden of Disease Study. Number 2 would be adding more whole grains, not refined processed bagels and donuts, whole grains, 100% whole wheat bread, brown rice, 100% whole wheat pasta, and similar whole grains. And finally, the third life expectancy food was nuts. We see it again. It's a blue zone tradition, a Loma Linda tradition. Lots of data about nuts and endothelial function, nuts and lowering cholesterol, nuts and brain function. I love walnuts for their omega-3 content because we struggle to get enough omega-3 in our plant-based diet. Which 2 food groups did the Global Burden Disease Study find had the greatest decrease in life expectancy? Our friends, red meat and processed meat. And they robbed people of years of life on this modeling predictive study. So we don't need more and more confirmation, but when studies come out like this, it's nice to see legumes, whole grains, and nuts. And in fact, it's very busy. But if you look to the left, optimal diet, and you look at the first 3 things that are most impactful at extending LE, life expectancy, legumes number 1, whole grains number 2, and nuts number 3. And the next 2, along with sugar and refined grains, drop life expectancy. Thank you, Global Burden of Disease Study. And the last research I want to point out to you just got published April 1, 2022 about eggs and mortality. And boy, is this a fight back and forth for a variety of reasons. It's difficult research. Our gut microbiome differs, our genetics differ, and funding issues are prominent. Eating eggs increases the risk of dying from heart disease in a publication called Associations of Dietary Cholesterol, Serum Cholesterol, and Egg Consumption with Overall and Cause-Specific Mortality, and a systematic review and update meta-analysis. Very, very respected journal called Circulation. Bullet point number 2, researchers compared egg and cholesterol consumption and blood cholesterol levels with death from cardiovascular disease in over 27,000 participants and conducted a systematic review of existing research. Eating 1 egg per day significantly increased the risk of dying from coronary heart disease. Higher blood cholesterol levels and higher intakes of dietary cholesterol were also associated with an elevated risk of death from heart disease. These findings support limiting dietary cholesterol intake for improved heart health. Pretty powerful data. Of course, it's database, association, observation data, but it's still powerful, and it just is hitting the news. Although it didn't make as many headlines as the avocado data. Everybody loves the avocado, but people don't want to hear the news, apparently, that eggs and mortality may be linked. So what did the wise Benjamin Franklin say? Change is the only constant in life. One's ability to adapt to those changes will determine your success in life. I've talked about a lot of changes over the years that we've seen in nutritional science. Thank you for listening. I'm happy to answer questions in our remaining 20 minutes. And thank you to The Real Truth About Health, Steve Shores, and others for having me on again. It was a pleasure to speak to this great audience. I'll be back next weekend with a interesting talk about longevity I think you'll benefit from.
Thank you very, very much, Dr. Kahn. Thorough, as always. We really, really appreciate that. Dr. Kahn, before we jump into Q&A, where can everybody go ahead and get your books?
That's kind of you. Yeah, I actually have authored 6 books. They're all different. The most recent is now about a year ago, the Lipoprotein A book, which just for the recipes is worth the relatively small paperback price. And also the plant-based solution, published about 3 years ago, has some really fantastic recipes that have helped people. They're very different books. Dead Execs Don't Get Bonuses is a attempt to prevent heart attack, short book. They're all on the major booksellers. I don't want to promote one over the other, but you can find them, and they're on my website, drjoelkahn.com, or come to my clinic. We've got plenty of them, and I'll be happy to put a personalized message in the book.
Perfect. Thank you very much for that as well. And so I'm going to make sure our audience knows, and certainly some of them already do, some might not, how we go about our Q&A here. And that is this, folks, go ahead and look at your Zoom window. You'll see different tabs. One of those tabs is called your reactions tab. You click on your reactions tab. And when you do that, you'll see a couple of emojis pop up. One of them says raise hand. You go ahead and click raise hand, and we will see your hands raised. And we'll get to as many questions as we possibly can until our next lecture. And so with that, Dr. Kahn, if you're ready, we'll jump right in.
I am so ready.
I love that. Thank you. We dig that about you. In fact, I want to make sure everybody also understands what I'll do is I will go ahead and call you by your first name, and I'll unmute you as I bring you in. And so with that, we will start with Aaron. Aaron, welcome.
Hi, Doctor. Thank you so much for an amazing presentation. It was really eye-opening. I did a CAT scan for my arteries about 2 years ago, and unfortunately found that I have about 50% blockage in my arteries. I changed my whole lifestyle to become a full vegan, plant-based diet, exercising. And my first question for you, Doctor, is after 3 years, what kind of test would you recommend me to do or to consider in order to see if there is any improvement? I know that cats can have, as you mentioned in your presentation, some radiation. You mentioned the test CIMT. I learned about it from you, also from some previous presentation. I asked my primary care physician to do it, and he refused. Is there any way?
Aaron, can I ask you, where do you live?
I live in Framingham, Massachusetts, near Boston.
Okay. And I can help you set up the testing at a distance and do a lot of consultation outside of Michigan. But, these are general comments. There have been amazing advances in heart CT measurements using artificial intelligence. Some people call that deep machine learning. And we now have the ability, unlike any other time, where I can tell patients exactly the content of their heart arteries, how much is hard plaque, soft plaque, called low density, soft plaque, very dangerous, the amount of volume in the artery, the amount of narrowing the artery. And for certain people, that's a good choice. It's always going to be a CT with radiation. There's no other kind of CT, and you have to have healthy kidneys. The CIMT can be arranged. It's a difficult study to find and difficult to get a good quality. You'd think it'd be easy in Boston with all the Harvard hospitals I've tried. That might be an excellent choice too. And I finally will say for the audience in general, stress testing has some role. I don't order nuclear radioactive stress tests. I order routine or echo ultrasound stress tests. But there's nothing better than seeing somebody be able to go above average fitness and do well. It's indirect, but very important data. So don't want to give you more specific ideas because we have to be general here. And you always want to work with your own medical team. Thank you, Aaron. Good luck.
Thanks very much for that, Dr. Kahn. And up next, we're going to bring in Lee S. Lee, welcome.
Hi, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Kahn. Clearly, fish is not plant-based, but I am 90% plant-based in my diet, but I do consume fish oil every day. And I recently read that certain level, taking fish oil, if you have a proclivity to having AFib, it could raise your chances of getting AFib. And I'm just concerned, I know that you're vegan, but what your objective opinion is about fish oil and AFib.
Yeah, I have lots of patients that aren't vegan, and I deal with them too, and we love on them. The studies you're talking about used very high dose pharmacologic versions of fish oil, Vasipa, Lovaza, and others. Most people don't take anywhere near those doses, and they're just buying kind of balanced fish oil at vitamin shops or from a integrative doc. I've had people in practice in atrial fib for years, never observed anybody with that, but we have to be concerned. And maybe, like many things, there's a sweet spot, some dosing of omega-3 supplements, but not massive dosing. Although I will say, although Dr. Ornish's studies weren't huge, he did use 4 grams a day, which is considered high dose omega-3 from a fish source. And at least in those patients, no reports of atrial fibrillation. But I just wouldn't go ultra high. If you can get more omega-3 from ground flaxseed, chia seeds, hemp hearts, walnuts, chlorella. We forget that chlorella, a real food that provides omega-3 and 40 minerals and nutrients, also is very rich in omega-3. So I like my patients to actually supplement with a handful of chlorella every day. It's very, very healthy.
Thanks very much for that, Dr. Kahn. And up next, we're going to bring in Joel. Welcome, Joel.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Kahn. I greatly appreciated your presentation and all the work you do even beyond the conference. My question is this: that CardioPrev study was mind-blowing. I mean, it's obviously very much different from what we've been hearing in the vegan community for quite a while now. My question is this: I'm not sure I fully understood some of the results. If the focus of the study, and at least in part that you presented, seemed to be a difference between a Mediterranean diet and more extra virgin olive oil, comparing it to a low-fat diet. Is it possible to use a bad pun here that we could have our cake and eat it too? It seems like the amount of calories in olive oil, if we have half a tablespoon a day, would only be roughly, 80 calories, and we could still maintain a very low-fat diet. So I'm a little confused about that 35% number and exactly where we should be in our fat intake during the day.
Well, again, that's, I think, good question, and I'm glad your name's Joel. But it's a controversy. I mean, and that it's been a controversy since Dr. Ansel Keys pointed out high-fat diet in Crete, high-fat diet in Finland were very different, and that is data that everybody recognizes in the nutrition world. So you have to go to be a bit of a biochemist and look at saturated fat content and plant versus animal fat content and the rest. As I said, what a joy it would have been if the CardioPrev study had an arm that was whole food plant-based and less than 15% of calories total fat, more like a traditional cardiac reversal diet that we talked about, but they just didn't do it and might not accept it. if anything, you might have thought that what they called their low fat arm, and it certainly was not ultra low fat, but they encouraged people to eat more legumes and whole grains, meaning they probably were eating less meats and dairy and poultry. You'd think that might be the winner in this study, and it's obviously provocative that it wasn't even close. And what they still haven't reported on is overall survival and events. So we do need to keep an open mind that so far they've got endothelial function data that's quite remarkable, and carotid artery regression and kidney health data that's quite remarkable. But we'll be looking for more study. Maybe next year there'll be an update. But I don't know what the optimal diet is, but I'm pretty sure one can argue on real food that's brightly colored and rich in antioxidants, a high polyphenol extra virgin olive oil is one of the least dangerous choices you can make.
Reminds me of those old commercials. Motor oil is not motor oil. It's not all olive oil is created the same as well, I'm sure.
It's very well. There's recently been reports. This is true of our food industry, that a source of extra virgin olive oil from Spain was actually seed oils and not olive oil. There's fraud in many food industries. People buy salmon, it's not salmon, and they do genetic testing, and it's not the fish they were told it was. And if you can make some money and provide a lower quality product, one has to be pretty picky. The couple of brands I showed, I don't know all the specifics, but I think you could rely on for being the authentic version promoted, and they're high polyphenol, which is probably the best of all worlds.
Excellent. Thanks, Dr. Kahn. And up next, we're going to bring in Wayne. Hi, Wayne.
Hi, thank you. My question is about coconut oil. Is it to be avoided at all costs, or is it not a reasonable oil for sauteing and, maybe frying or high heat?
Yeah, I can't find, I've evolved my own thinking. I've written a number of articles on avoiding oils in general and bringing the healthiest diets to a very low total fat content. And I've evolved my thinking because the science appeared. I don't see that happening with coconut oil. I don't see any new data. Maybe there's one small randomized study in people with early memory problems in the last year, I think I read, that suggested there might be a benefit in a very specialized group of people with early risk of dementia. But with the exception of that single study, I don't see the community finding research or recommendations that there's anything good about coconut oil. It seems to be the most injurious to our lining of our gut, causing that metabolic endotoxemia and inflammation. Of course, there's many practitioners use coconut oil to relieve inflammation, but the actual data suggests it's harmful to our gut. It can drive inflammation, and it certainly will raise your cholesterol. What I tell my patients, because again, not all my patients are vegan, if you're going to go off on a binge and do a 4 or 6 week keto, paleo, coconut oil in your coffee crazy program, get your cholesterol done before and maybe 4 to 6 weeks later, because about 30 to 40% of people, the cholesterol skyrockets. And don't take it by chance, do it by a systematic science approach. And obviously get the heck off of it if your cholesterol is 400, which can happen. And I've seen it many times.
Thank you very much for that, Dr. Kahn. Up next, we're going to bring in Sharon. Hi, Sharon. Welcome.
Hi. I have a question I've been wondering about for many, many years. I'm 72. I've been on a whole food plant-based diet since 2012 when I was diagnosed with mantle cell lymphoma. And before that, for years, when I lay down at night to go to sleep, my heart feels like it's fluttering, flip-flopping. And years ago, my doctor said not to worry about it. So I kind of did, but I've often thought about it since I've been whole food plant-based, it doesn't do it as often. And I only feel it when I'm laying down to go to sleep. So what's happening, and should I be concerned?
Sure. So again, general comments, and thank you for your question. Technology advances, not just nutrition science. So many of my patients have an Apple Watch, and I don't have, maybe I have stock in Apple. I don't know. I don't think I do. I wish I did. An Apple Watch can monitor heart rate, can monitor a full 12-lead electrocardiogram. My mother, God bless her, turning 90 soon, sends me her full electrocardiogram from her Apple Watch. If she has any irregularity, she senses, and it's extremely useful and accurate. People that don't want an Apple Watch, it's expensive. You can go on one of the big online sellers. There's a device I didn't make called Cardia, Kardia. It costs between $69 and $89. If you have a smartphone, if you're having those flutterings, you put your fingers on this little device you buy, and your smartphone shows you your heart rhythm. And my patients all the time send me, look, I had fluttering last night. What do you think of my recording? And I tell them not to worry. It's really diagnostic. You need data. And even heart monitors. Talk to your doctor. If you're having these most nights, there are now heart monitors that are the size of a Band-Aid. They are so tiny. It's what I use in my clinic. And people don't mind wearing them for 48 hours, 14 days. So you really want to try and nail down what it is, because there are very benign flutterings. And then there's something called fibrillation, and you don't want to take the risk that you're having fibrillation. You just got to find out.
Thanks, Dr. Kahn. And up next, we are going to bring in Xenia. Welcome.
Hello, how are you?
I'm great, thank you.
Very good. Thank you for sharing this information, Doc. My question, I'm really puzzled about this egg business. I've been promoting it for a while because for to lower the cholesterol issues, the niacin factor of it. So I've been promoting this in this new study that has come up. I don't know, I think it's recently, but I'm just really puzzled with this egg. Should I do it or not do it? Because I've been promoting it for a long time.
Right. I presented the most recent study, which is also an overview about many older studies of quality. This is certainly not the first and only study, and it's been like a tennis match, back and forth. And you always have to see who did the study, who funded the study, who are the researchers funded by. And it's difficult to do nutrition research. We're not all the same. In my clinic, I do a blood test on patients that tells me if their gut, if their genetics cause them to increase cholesterol absorption if they change their diet. If you're one of those, they're called hyperabsorbers. It's a simple blood test. And you start adding in more egg yolk, you're going to see your blood cholesterol go up. Now, there's other people that are not hyperabsorbers, and if they're eating eggs in a mixed diet, they may not see much rise in their blood cholesterol. But most people don't do it as a study. They just see one more headline that promotes eating eggs as a healthy brain food, and they're adding lots and lots of eggs. And they don't ask the question, I wonder if that's working for me. How did my cholesterol do on that? So if you're going to shift your diet, and I'd always advise a no egg diet to my patients, but if they're going to do it, I tell them to have a very limited amount of egg white with lots of vegetables. I don't do that. I am 100% plant-based, but if they're going to, that's consistent with Dr. Ornish's reversible studies. That's an option, although they don't necessarily need the plant-based protein in the egg whites. There's plenty of, the animal-based protein in the egg whites. There's plenty of plant-based proteins. So I'd suggest you to look over all the data. I think the study I presented is very powerful.
Thanks very much for that, Dr. Kahn. Up next, we have Kathy. Welcome, Kathy.
Hi, thank you for taking my call. Yeah, I was wondering about blockage in the heart and changing your diet. I've been working on that for a while, on changing it, but I seem to have problems in my lower legs with swelling, and I'm wondering. I think that has to do with my heart not pumping strong enough, but I've also been told that it has to do with the veins and not compressing or not doing what the veins are supposed to do. What do you recommend, doctor, about anything that would help with that particular issue?
You know, again, can't examine you over the Zoom meeting and want to be general in my comment, but you know, doctors develop something called a differential diagnosis. And when I see a patient with leg swelling, I do that. And could they have varicose veins after having delivered children or for other reasons? Absolutely. Might require an ultrasound of the leg veins and see if they're present. Could they be on a medication that causes ankle swelling, like some of the most popular medications used in the world? Absolutely. Could there be a cardiac problem? Yes. And there are both echocardiograms that are usually ordered and sometimes a blood test called the BNP, Betty, Nancy, Patty, BNP blood level. That's widely available and very informative. And you want it to be normal. So you have to go through all that. There are some nutrients in plants that are very good for veins. They're not all food plants. There's one called pycnogenol from the bark of a French pine tree, PYCNOGENOL. There's an antioxidant called rutin, RUTIN, that does come from foods, and others that promote healthy veins. You might read about them, and certain vitamin companies make supplements for healthy veins, but you probably want to figure out why. That's what I'd recommend to a patient in my clinic.
Thanks very, very much for that, Dr. Kahn. And in fact, thank you for all of this. You know, folks, we are up against the clock and it's time to bring out our next lecture. So sorry we couldn't get to every question, but Dr. Kahn, want to thank you so, so much. Again, very thorough as always, very informative, very useful for all of us. And we're looking forward to having you back next week. And thank you for that. And I know I'm not the only person that wants to thank you. So I'm going to have our tech team unmute our entire audience. And please, everybody, what do you want to say to Dr. Kahn?
Thank you.
Everything